Today we're talking about cryptography, a fascinating discussion and a subject that I knew very little about before we had the opportunity to speak to Eleanor McMurtry, who's just finished their master's degree at the University of Melbourne, where they researched applied cryptography in the realm of e-voting. Eleanor is now doing their PhD in Zurich, and you'll hear some trams zipping past throughout our discussion. Also joining us is Vanessa Teague, who's one of the country's leading cybersecurity experts and the CEO of Thinking Cybersecurity and an adjunct associate professor at the ANU. I'd like to welcome both of you to the discussion today. Vanessa, why don't you tell me about your career and what it is that you do day to day?
I do cryptography with a particular focus on protocols that support democracy. I'm really interested in the security of elections and why we can sometimes do a better job of securing elections using computers, and also why sometimes it looks like it's better, but it's actually really easy to fiddle. So cryptography is maths at its core, but it's maths that you can turn into whatever you want it to be.
So when you say cryptography, my mind jumps to Bletchley Circle. And so obviously we're talking, there's obviously, a generation or two ago. What are we talking about now? If I'm trying to picture cryptography, what would be a useful way to frame that?
Well, some things haven't changed that much, actually. It's about breaking stuff, and it's also about building stuff that can't be broken. So in the early days, cryptography was all about keeping messages secret, and that's still a huge theme. So, for example, if I'm in election security, I'm thinking about how to keep the votes private from the people who are not supposed to be able to retrieve them. But modern cryptography actually contains a whole lot of fancy mathematical tools for other things that are good for security, such as being able to prove that you are the person who knows a particular secret, or being able to prove that you've performed a particular computation in the right way without revealing more detail about what you've done than you want to. And you can see how all of this is actually really useful for protecting your privacy online, making sure your elections have been properly conducted, doing contact tracing without revealing more information than you need to, and so forth.
It sounds like that there's always been a need to be able to sort of communicate or verify who you are or be access to a certain level of information. But all those examples you just gave me, it's like everything's ramped up super quickly. But like you mentioned, contact tracing, like the idea we wouldn't really have understood contact tracing 2 years ago. That's changed.
No, I certainly wouldn't have.
Yeah, that's changed the way we think about, access to information, verifying who you are and where you've been and what you've done, and all the privacy implications of that as well. Eleanor, can I ask you, how did you're in Zurich, you're doing your PhD. Can you tell us about your PhD, what you're studying, and how that relationship with Vanessa led to your adventures in Switzerland?
Yes, it's a strange story, right? So when I was in high school, what I wanted to do was to be a physicist. I wanted to study physics. I was really interested in quantum physics. A lot of people go, space, astrophysics, that's never really been my jam. But I found myself at Melbourne University studying a physics degree. That was lovely. I enjoyed that. And the end of that rolled around, and I was trying to decide, what do I do next? The problem is that the job market for academic physicists is not it's not the friendliest, you could say. So I was kind of thinking of other options, and I decided, well, I'm good at computer science. Maybe I can give this a go. So I enrolled in a master's program in computer science. So I'm good at this. There are jobs in it. Seems a good option. And I remember Vanessa gave a few lectures in my second year undergrad subject about cryptography, and I was thinking, I'm quite interested in security and privacy as a concept. I knew basically nothing about cryptography going into my master's. All I knew was there's something to do with big prime numbers. And that's about it, right? So I emailed Vanessa and Ben, who was another academic at Melbourne Uni, just to get some advice. And I was saying, I'm looking for a master's project. Do you have anything? Do you know anyone? And Vanessa had this really interesting idea sitting around from a few years ago to do with voting, to do with augmenting postal voting in a way that allows you to authenticate to make sure your vote made it through in the end. because we kind of think online voting is really risky. We want to vote on paper wherever we possibly can. But obviously, postal voting can introduce some issues. Maybe someone intercepts the mail. How do you know it got there? These kinds of issues. So that was what my master's project was focused on. You can call this applied cryptography because we're really focusing on designing a protocol, thinking about it carefully. Does it work? What can we prove about it? All this kind of thing. And I had a really good time with this. I found it really interesting. It's really neat thinking about this. It's like a game, right? You're the keeper of the secrets, and you're trying to keep it away from bad guys who are trying to find the secrets. So it's really fun to be able to think that way. I had fun masters. We had some success. Published a paper, and I decided, okay, well, maybe I should continue doing this. This seems good. I asked Vanessa again for recommendations. Who should I talk to? Where should I apply? And I found William Mauder's group here at ETH Zürich, who is doing much more theoretical cryptography. So I've taken a bit of a step away. I'm now more of a mathematician than a computer scientist or a privacy researcher, you could say. But I decided this would be a good way to round out my skills. So what do I mean? What is theoretical cryptography? This is a natural question, right? This is something, it's not necessarily easy to explain. The idea is that we have these applied cryptographers like Vanessa who say, okay, I'm going to take these building blocks that we have, take them for granted, say, I can encrypt a message, or I can do a digital signature to verify who wrote this message. And what I'm interested in is really thinking about, how do these systems actually work? What are the mathematical guarantees that we state? So for example, a really simple example, if I add two odd numbers, I always get an even number. This is a property of numbers that we can say this mathematically. If I take two odd numbers, add them together, I always get an even. This is the kind of thing I'm thinking about, but rather I'm thinking, how can we phrase these ideas of security and privacy, these kind of nebulous ideas that are hard to pin down? How can we phrase this mathematically so we can be absolutely sure that what we're doing is correct and really does what we think we're doing? So this is what I'm focusing on.
I think it's interesting, and correct me if I'm wrong, like we talk about research in a couple of ways, like applied research and then foundational research. And it looks like you're there digging around going, does this make sense? Are we really looking carefully at the assumptions that we're making? And Vanessa, you're looking about, how does this work in the world? What are the problems we need to solve? Now that we've got contact tracing and COVID-safe apps, are we thinking about this through the right lens? Would that be how you fit together?
Yeah, that's probably a good description at the moment.
There's sort of a fun interplay here, right? So theoretical cryptography, this foundational research, interestingly, you come across something while you're doing the maths, while you're ferreting around at the foundations. You just go, that's kind of strange. Like you say, it looks like we can do this thing that seems like it should be impossible, but it looks like we can do it. So then you go, well, now I have an idea. I can go talk to my applied cryptography friends. Hey, can we do something with this? This is something strange I noticed. So it goes back and forth, right? And for example, applied cryptographers might look at something and say, actually, I don't think this quite works. If we combine these two things in the right way, we get some strange results. And then I can look at this and go, that's strange. Maybe we should look at that a bit closer. So I think it's easy to say these are two very separate things, but I think the reality is a lot more complex and interwoven than that.
Vanessa, I just want to reference some work that you've done with some colleagues at Melbourne Uni on health data, which I think a lot of people went, okay. That, we are developing policy and we're understanding these things. There's obviously benefits to information in the world, and then there's obviously drawbacks and making decisions about where the line is. How do you feel as though the broader community, and I'm going to include government in that, work with people who are at the really bleeding edge of the kind of maths type approach that you are? Like, that's an interesting kind of dynamic for you to be saying, like, if you're saying we've got to go break stuff because we have to show it can be broken because it's better be broken by you guys than other people when we're talking about health information. These are big questions of our time when we're relying on people like yourselves to inform those discussions?
Yeah. Well, it's a good year when the Australian government doesn't make up a new way to send us to jail. I was about to say that 2021 had been a good year, but I don't think that's really the case. I think a lot of these things are about power, right? It's about power. Your health record is stored by people more powerful than you. Maybe it's stored by a GP and you trust your GP. It's obviously your GP needs it because they need to read it when they're making decisions about your health. Then some details about that record get passed into government for the purposes of Medicare reimbursement. And it's clear that some amount of detail has to be passed to government in order to get your Medicare and PBS reimbursements. So, okay, your GP needs it. The federal government gets it in order to get the rebate that presumably you want. Now what happens to it? Who gets to decide whether your medical record gets further shared? Is that your choice? Is that the choice of the entities more powerful than you who have it? Should you be paid for it? Should you have to give your consent before it's passed on? If they mess it up, should they have to tell you? Should they be punished if they've kind of egregiously created a data breach of some information that they were supposed to look after? Every country in the world is grappling with these questions, and different countries have come to very different decisions. Australia has very much walked the line of very free reuse of data that you happen to have, and very little in the way of practical restraint on the sharing of other people's data, particularly data that has supposedly been de-identified. Of course, the whole point was in this case the data was not adequately de-identified, and it's pretty easy to figure out whose medical record is whose. I was pretty disappointed with the way the Australian government responded to that. I'm still disappointed. It's still not too late for them to tell the affected people that they publish their identifiable medical records online. It's not the full medical record. It's the Medicare and PBS rebate information. But that's actually a lot of information. If I know what pharmaceuticals you've been reimbursed for, then I know a lot about you that maybe you didn't expect to be posted on the internet.
And to take this back a layer, because I think, for sort of younger people as well, what we're really talking about is having so many publicly available data sets that when you start washing them over each other, and that could be the stuff people are doing on Facebook, or it might be other things you've done, and all of a sudden being able to take all of those giant amounts of data, your skills are ultimately getting that signal and matching them all up and going, oh, hang on, if we know that many things about that people, we can start to re-anonymize, which in itself is fascinating, that there's so much of our life is online, that these data sets exist, which they didn't in the past.
Yes, absolutely. And I tell you what, it's not that complicated either. So the cryptography that Eleanor's doing, that's complicated. But re-identifying medical records, that's not complicated. So you get a medical record, you get a couple of baby photos off Facebook or Twitter, and you look at the photos that people say, I'm welcoming my new baby to the world, and here's the photo, and there's the date at the bottom of the tweet. You take one or two of them from the same person, and then you look up in the de-identified public Medicare records how many women of that age who live in that state have had babies on those dates. And the likelihood that there's more than one match, if you've got 2 or 3 baby birth dates, is basically zero.
That's not a lot of steps, is there?
Correct. It's not complicated at all. Yeah. And you don't need a lot of information about a person to identify them. This is sort of one of the truths that's come out of the scientific community that's counterintuitive, but it's actually clear enough if you think about it, right? You think that you're in a large crowd all the time. You think that if you've been to the MCG in a crowd of 50,000 and then you've been to the beach the day after and there were hundreds of other people there, and then you show up at school where there are 1,000 other people, that you're unique. But actually, if you think about the number of people that matched you on each of those 3 separate occasions on exactly the same day, there's probably nobody else unless you went there with another particular person. It's exactly the same for childbirth, right? There might be thousands of other babies born at the same date that you had a baby. But if you've had 2 or 3 children, the likelihood that there's another Australian mum out there who perfectly lined up with you lockstep for 2 or 3 childbirths is basically zero.
It's now talking about patterns, you can start to see about like the patterns and likelihood, and like it is fascinating. And the other step to that, if we're starting to talk about, I guess, democracy, and then we start talking about mathematics and cryptography and democracy, and I'd be keen for both of you when, there's obviously a huge discussion last year about in the US elections about lost votes, and I was hearing these really kind of personal stories of a person being responsible for who knew the community, who could say, no, this person hasn't died, and very kind of 1.0 hands-on ratifying of the voting system. What were you thinking as that was happening, and where are we now, and where will we be in the next 5 years when it comes to electronic voting?
So what I really want to stress first, right, is there's this tendency to assume that electronic voting is an easy problem, right? You log onto a website, you fill out a form on the website, you submit it, you're done, you're voted, right? There's a lot of what's driving this kind of discourse and this kind of attitude in the US and globally is this idea that electronic voting is easy, or that voting at all, in fact, is easy, but especially that the internet makes it even easier. And what our research is finding, what I've certainly found in my master's, what Vanessa has found repeatedly during her career, is that it is not easy. There are many, many complicated things, many ways it can go wrong, many ways people can be misled, many ways people can be coerced or defrauded. It's actually quite a complicated problem. And I think a really important first step is to really acknowledge, yes, voting is hard. Voting online is doubly so. I think that's something really important to remember.
And is that because once you start talking about online voting, you're talking about all those other grey areas that happen when where you're talking about the things we experience every day around phishing or like coercive behaviour and Facebook, like where do those lines of one might be considered propaganda and misinformation, and then we end up in the transactional element of electronic voting? So do you see those worlds becoming more blended when you start talking? Is that part of the challenge?
I'll hand it over to Vanessa in a second, but I think it's part of it. There's also the problem of online voting. It's tempted to say, oh, you can do this at home, but then if you're all voting at home, then let's say you live in a family with strict parents, the parents may be like watching you vote, right? You have no way to guarantee this confidentiality, whereas if you go to a polling booth, you're alone in the polling booth, there is no one watching you vote. So there are all of these different axes, and it's not just the intersection of social media of the ability for organizations to influence people perhaps more directly. It's all of these practical things as well. And technologists, people who work in Silicon Valley, we are often blinded to this fact. We often go, we can do that. We can write the code. We can make the app. It's easy. Yeah.
Vanessa, I guess part of that then is about credentialing the person sitting in front of that computer at home, and that they actually are who they are, and that they are in a situation where they are free to vote as they wish to.
Possibly, yes, although that's only a tiny part of the problem, actually. I think even if you could be absolutely certain of who they were, for the coercion reasons that Eleanor has mentioned, it still doesn't work. Right? It doesn't actually solve the fundamental design problem of voting, which is getting a public evidence trail out of secret ballots. Right? If you didn't care about vote privacy or coercion, online voting would be really easy. Everybody could just post their vote publicly to a website and we could all count them. But it's verifying that the votes haven't been fiddled at the same time as protecting the privacy of individual votes that makes it really hard.
It's like a wicked problem, isn't it? It's like
It is. It is. And if you think about how an ordinary polling place works, you walk up, you pick up your blank piece of paper, you go into a little booth, you walk out into a public area of the polling place with your folded piece of paper and stick it into the box. It's actually really carefully designed. You vote in private, but you vote in private in such a way that everybody else standing out in the polling place can see that everybody cast exactly one vote into each box, and everybody can stand around and watch the count. So that combined pair of properties, everybody votes in secret, but there's kind of public verifiability of the process that shows us that nobody fiddled the results, is achieved in a carefully designed process in our polling places. We don't know how to do that over the internet.
And where are we going? Who's managed from a country perspective, or even from a technology perspective? Like, where are I always hear about sort of very small European countries that seem to do this really well. I think Estonia comes up quite regularly. But and if it is sort of fundamentally tricky, is the paper-based system? Is that ultimately more, democratic and inclusive?
Yeah, I think it's better because it's harder to fiddle the answers, right? I think there are good things that you can do with computers in a polling place that have some of the best of both worlds, like better accessibility for voters with disabilities without throwing away the evidence and privacy. I don't think Estonia has got there yet. In fact, our co-author, Olivier Pereira, published a note a few days ago explaining that a malicious voting device could undetectably fiddle a vote in the Estonian electoral system, and defeat the verification mechanisms that they had in place.
It's a fascinating discussion. So, can I just ask both of you? Obviously, Eleanor, your research is quite focused right now, and the other applications we talked earlier about, the COVID safe app and contact tracing has all of a sudden become language of the day, and a privacy citizen benefit tension point that we all understand enough to be asking questions. What will be coming next, do you think? Where do we think that these sorts of ways that technology and the specialist work that you do, what will be the problems of the future or the challenges of the future that you think will be coming down the line? Big question, sorry.
Yeah, no, it is. It is a big question. I think one thing to be aware of is we're staring down. There's this old sort of term or slang word that cryptographers like to throw around called the crypto wars. In the 90s, the early 2000s, when there were a lot of questions about should people have access to encrypted messaging. The bad guy is going to have this, and the US, in fact, made a well-known encryption algorithm a munition under its legislation, so that technically exporting this algorithm would be illegal. And there was this big debate of what does it even mean to export an idea? And hackers at the time, by hackers I just mean the general sense, not necessarily just bad guys, they put out a shirt that had some code that would implement this written on it, and underneath it would say, "This shirt is a munition." So this is like 20 years ago, right? But it's happening all over again, all of a sudden. We see in Australia there was an infamous amongst us cryptographers piece of legislation a few years ago called Telecommunications and Other Legislative Amendments Act, which allows the Australian government to force a company to weaken their technology to allow law enforcement access to it. And it's secret. The company is not allowed to tell anyone that they were forced to do this. And we also see, I think, I'm unsure how known this is in the general public, but in my circles, Apple has been discussing scanning iCloud photos for illegal material. And I think no sensible cryptographer would argue that the material they're scanning for is a good thing to have in the world. You can look into it yourself. I'd rather not talk about it in detail. But the question is, should we allow a company to scan through our personal files at all. This is a serious privacy concern when the contents of these photos are supposed to be secret. Apple says, we encrypt these in the cloud, no one can access them except you. And yes, they're still going through them anyway, using a roundabout mechanism. So we're seeing all of these questions rise up again suddenly. And it's this tension between how can we safeguard privacy? How can we keep people perhaps living under authoritarian regimes safe? How can we have everyday people just communicate privately? Is this a fundamental right we should have? This debate is rearing its head again, and there are serious questions about how can we make a compromise between, say, the safety of trafficked people and the need for privacy. This is, again, becoming a really important question. I think we'll see a lot of this, again, continuing to discuss in the near future.
I think you've raised some really, really interesting and important points. And, as you were talking, when you're talking about Apple, then, it's like, well, when does Apple decide that it's whether or not I can have photos of my children who are playing in the backyard pool? Or
yes, why should Apple be able to make this decision exactly?
Or with the, assistance and access, it's like, well, we're trusting that you are using these powers for good, but when does that change? And does it changes of government or changes of philosophy, or where does the line where we get to kind of reassess these? So it is a movable feast. I completely agree.
Something I wanted to mention while we're on the topic is that it's easy to pretend, we're just doing maths. This isn't politics. This isn't related to these issues. And to which I say, there is an excellent essay by a widely regarded cryptographer, Philip Roggeway. The essay is called The Moral Character of Cryptographic Work. I would highly encourage anyone interested in this sort of thing, have a read of it. It's an excellent balanced essay on whether what we do is inherently political, and he argues it is.
It's fascinating stuff, and I think what I'm certainly hearing is that young people today are looking at careers, particularly if they're interested in STEM careers, that have an impact. And like what you're just saying is, when you're talking about cryptography, it's inherently a point of view about the flow of information, and that is
and power.
That is itself powerful or empowering, or the opposite. So it is a really interesting discussion. We're going to wrap up in a second, but Vanessa, I wanted to sort of get a sense, if you were talking to your 15-year-old self now, you've obviously you work in an area that you're passionate about and very good at, what would you tell your 15-year-old self?
What would I tell my 15-year-old self? I think I would believe less bullshit about how much uppity women are wanted, right? Some people like uppity women, especially other uppity women. And I've had good working relationships with a lot of men and women in the tech sector and in academia. But don't go believing that everybody welcomes input from intelligent women with technical knowledge. Almost by definition, if you are rearranging the world according to the power structures you'd prefer to see, then you're going to offend some of the people who are benefiting from the power structures that are there. And doing that through technology is no different from doing that through politics or any other domain that alters power. And I think I'd be more willing to offend more people by speaking more honestly about stuff.
I reckon that's great advice, and it really is all the things we just talked about around the power stuff and dismantling or looking at, and you team that with some of the gender stuff, and it's a rich area for exploration. I expect, Vanessa. Eleanor, what would you tell your 15-year-old self?
I think I would say that just because someone is saying something very confidently does not make it true, does not make it relevant, does not make it relevant to the decisions you should make about your life. This is especially true if this is a person in power, a professor, a head of department, whatever the case may be. This is extra especially true when it is an older man talking to a younger woman. I would say you listen to people, they have advice to give, but just because they say it confidently does not make it true. I think that is the number one thing I would emphasize to myself.
I reckon that's fantastic advice from both of you. I've really learned a lot in this discussion, and I really appreciate you both taking the time. It's been fascinating, and I think a lot of food for thought for me particularly, and I'm sure anyone watching and listening today. Vanessa Teague and Eleanor McMurtry, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It is my pleasure.